Hey there, sleepy wasteland wanderers. Tonight, we're diving into the haunting beauty of the Fallout universe, where broken cities whisper forgotten stories, and every shadow hides a tale of survival. I'll be your guide through these glowing ruins, sharing quiet moments of hope, resilience, and the eerie calm of a world long gone. How the lottery in Vault 11 was rigged, Fallout lore. Welcome, fellow wanderer of the wasteland's most carefully sealed histories, to a journey into the vault where a community was given a simple and terrible rule and left to discover what they would do with it across the decades of their sealed existence. Tonight we trace Vault 11, what it was designed to produce, what its residents made of the institution they inherited, and what the lottery drum's final silence reveals about the specific human capacity for accommodation that the experiment was built to measure. So settle in, let your body grow heavy, and allow the hum of sealed vault machinery on frequencies that have not carried a living voice in many years to carry you gently into the dark. The drum has stopped turning. It has not always been still. There is a quality that belongs to institutions whose design contains within it the specific outcome they are nominally testing for, a quality of rigged inevitability that distinguishes the genuine experiment from the demonstration, from the institutional arrangement that is not truly asking a question about human behavior, because the specific combination of pressures and incentives built into the arrangement has already determined, with a thoroughness that only the willfully ignorant could mistake for genuine uncertainty, what the answer to the question will be. Vault-Tech's experimental program was organized around genuine questions about human behavior in some of its expressions, and around something closer to demonstrations in others. And understanding which category Vault 11's specific design belongs to is the prerequisite for understanding what the Vault's history actually reveals about the people who lived within it, and what it reveals about the institution that built the space their lives were lived in. The broader Vault experimental program emerged from the specific institutional context of the pre-war United States government's relationship with Vault-Tech, a relationship that combined the government's genuine need for civilian survival infrastructure with Vault-Tech's institutional interest in the extraordinary research opportunities that a network of sealed, controlled, long-duration human communities would provide for the study of social behavior, psychological adaptation, and the specific dynamics of communities under extreme and sustained stress. The research traditions that the Vault experiments drew on were the research traditions of pre-war social psychology and organizational behavior, the study of how human communities organize themselves, how authority is established and maintained and challenged, how individual behavior is shaped by institutional context, and what the specific conditions are under which communities accept, normalize, and eventually resist the institutional arrangements that govern their lives. These were genuine and important research questions, and the Vault program's capacity to generate data about them across timescales and under conditions of control that no conventional research program could approach was genuinely extraordinary from the perspective of the researchers, whose institutional interests the program served. What distinguished the Vault program from conventional social research was not the questions it asked, but the methods it used to generate answers. And the specific character of those methods is essential for understanding the moral status of everything the program produced, including the specific history of Vault 11. The Vault experiments did not observe human behavior in naturally occurring conditions. They created specific conditions designed to produce specific forms of behavioral stress, and then observed how the people placed within those conditions responded. The researchers were not documenting what communities do when they face specific challenges, but creating the challenges whose documentation was the experiment's purpose, which means that the suffering the experiments produced was not incidental to the research program, but constitutive of it. Not an unfortunate side effect of studying something that was happening anyway, but the specific product of a deliberate, institutional decision to create the conditions that would produce the suffering whose documentation served research purpose. Vault 11's specific experimental design reflects this general character of the Vault program in its most complete and most philosophically deliberate expression. The specific rule that the Vault's overseer computer was programmed to communicate to the residents upon sealing that one resident must be sacrificed each year, delivered to the sacrificial chamber where the automated systems would end their life, or the Vault's systems would execute everyone within. It was not a natural consequence of the Vault's engineering requirements, or a response to some genuine resource constraint that the sealed environment imposed. It was a designed institutional pressure created deliberately by the people who built the Vault, whose specific purpose was to place the community in a situation whose specific features, the regular requirement for sacrifice, the threat of collective death as the alternative, the absence of any external authority that could adjudicate the conflict between the individual's interest in survival and the community's interest in sacrifice, would generate the specific social and political dynamics that the researchers wanted to observe. The physical design of Vault 11 reflects the experimental requirements with the thoroughness of a facility that was built to conduct this specific experiment, rather than adapted to it after the fact. The sacrificial chamber is the most architecturally distinctive feature of the Vault's layout, a space whose specific design, the access corridor, the terminal through which the annual sacrifice was delivered and processed, the systems whose specific operation was the mechanism through which the annual requirement was fulfilled, communicates the purpose it was built to serve with a clarity that the Vault's residents could not have missed from the process. Moment the overseer computer communicated the terms of their sealed existence. The overseer terminal and its specific communication protocols were designed to present the sacrifice requirement in terms whose specific framing, the combination of absolute authority and apparent procedural neutrality that the computer's communications maintained throughout the Vault's operational life, was intended to reinforce the institutional character of the requirement, to present it as a feature of the Vault's design whose specific terms were non-negotiable, rather than as a policy whose specific content could be the subject of community deliberation. The question of who was selected as Vault 11's initial resident population is a question whose complete answer the available documentation does not provide, but whose general contours can be inferred from the specific character of the experimental design and from what the Vault's subsequent history reveals about the specific social composition of the community that the sealing produced. The founding population appears to have been a broadly representative cross-section of the pre-war American civilian population, the kind of community that a genuine civilian survival shelter would have been expected to contain, reflecting the demographic and occupational diversity that the Vault program's cover story, as a humanitarian survival initiative, required it to present to the public. There is no available evidence that the founding population was specifically selected for the particular combination of social vulnerability and political ambition that would make the lottery's corruption most likely, though the experimental design's specific features suggest that its designers understood that any sufficiently large community placed under the specific institutional pressure that Vault 11's rule created would eventually produce the dynamics they were interested in observing. The informed consent question is perhaps the most morally acute single issue that Vault 11's experimental design presents, because the answer to the question of whether the Vault's residents knew the specific terms of their sealed existence before the Vault closed determines the moral character of the initial institutional relationship between the researchers and the research subjects with a directness that the subsequent history's moral complexity does not obscure. The available evidence strongly suggests that the residents did not know the lottery rule before sealing that the overseer computer's announcement of the sacrifice requirement was genuinely new information for the people who received it, that they had entered the Vault under the understanding that it was a survival shelter whose terms were the terms that Vault Tech's public communications described, and that the specific shock and disbelief that the vault's early records suggest accompanied the announcement reflected a genuine encounter with information whose content was not anticipated. This absence of informed consent is not a peripheral feature of the experimental design but a central one, because the experiment's capacity to generate the specific data it was designed to collect depended on the community's response to the sacrifice requirement, being a genuine response to a genuinely unexpected institutional situation, rather than a performance of response by people who had chosen to participate with full knowledge of what participation required. The researchers needed the community's decisions to be real decisions, made under conditions of genuine constraint and genuine uncertainty, rather than choices made by people whose prior knowledge of the terms allowed them to prepare responses that reflected their considered judgment about how to navigate a situation they had known they were entering. The absence of informed consent was, in this specific sense, a methodological requirement of the experimental design, a feature whose presence was necessary for the experiment to work as intended, which means that the deception of the vault's residents was not an oversight or an ethical failure that the researchers failed to anticipate, but a deliberate choice whose necessity they had considered and accepted as the price of the data they wanted to collect. The pre-war institutional context that gave Vault-Tec the authority to make this choice is the context of an organization whose relationship with the federal government provided cover for activities that the normal mechanisms of research ethics oversight would not have permitted, an organization whose public role as the provider of civilian survival infrastructure gave it access to the specific population people seeking shelter from the nuclear threat, whose participation in the experimental program the research required. The specific relationship between the Vault program and the congressional and executive continuity programs that the Enclave's institutional history documents suggests that the people who authorized the Vault experiments were not simply private sector researchers operating outside normal oversight, but participants in a broader governmental program whose specific goals gave the experimental program's methods a degree of official sanction that would not have been available in any other context. Whether this official sanction constitutes a meaningful moral distinction between Vault-Tec's institutional behavior and simple human experimentation without consent is a question that the available evidence does not resolve in the direction of moral exculpation, but whose answer requires understanding the full institutional context rather than evaluating the experimental design in isolation from the broader program it served. What the experimental design's specific architecture establishes, with a clarity that the subsequent history only confirms, is that Vault 11 was built to document a specific trajectory of human moral behavior under specific institutional conditions, and that the researchers who built it understood the trajectory they expected to document well enough to design the physical and procedural environment that would facilitate its documentation most completely. The sacrificial chamber was built to receive sacrifices. The lottery mechanism was designed to be manipulable by the political actors that the sacrifice requirement's annual pressure would inevitably produce. The overseer computer's communication protocols were designed to maintain the institutional authority of the sacrifice requirement across the full range of social and political responses that the community might develop in reaction to it. The Vault was, in this specific sense, built for the history it eventually produced, not in the sense that the researchers could predict every specific development of the community's political life, but in the sense that the institutional environment they created was designed to make the general trajectory of moral accommodation and political corruption that the Vault's history documents not simply possible, but likely, even close to inevitable, given sufficient time and sufficient institutional pressure. Understanding this is the prerequisite for understanding what Vault 11's history actually reveals about the people who lived within it, because the alternative understanding, the understanding that reads the Vault's history, as a simple demonstration of human wickedness, whose perpetrators bear sole responsibility for the specific moral catastrophe. The Vault, produced, misses the most important single feature of the story, which is the relationship between the institutional design and the human behavior it produced. The people who rigged Vault 11's lottery were not brought to the Vault because they were the specific kind of people who would rig lotteries. They were ordinary people placed in a specific institutional environment designed to produce the specific pressures and the specific incentives that make lottery rigging a rational response to an individually intolerable situation. And what their specific responses to those pressures and incentives reveal about human moral psychology is something more important and more unsettling than simple wickedness. Because simple wickedness is a quality that can be identified and excluded and managed, while the specific human tendencies that Vault 11's history documents are tendencies that the evidence suggests are close to universal in their distribution across the full range of human personality and moral development. The Vault sealed, the computer spoke. The community that had entered believing they were survivors discovered they were subjects. And the specific history that followed from that discovery is the history that this account was assembled to trace. Not simply the history of what the lottery's corruption produced, but the history of how it was produced. The specific sequence of human decisions and institutional pressures and social dynamics whose aggregate constitutes the most complete single case study in the franchise's history of what sealed institutional conditions do to the communities that inhabit them. The moment of sealing is the moment that determines everything that follows in any Vault's history. Because sealing is not simply the closing of a door, but the creation of a world, the specific transformation of a finite physical space from a temporary refuge into the permanent totality of a community's existence, the conversion of a shelter into a society, the replacement of the outside world's endless complexity and endless possibility with the Vault's specific inventory of rooms and people and resources and rules. Every Vault's sealing produced this transformation, and every Vault community's subsequent history was shaped by the specific character of the world the sealing created. But Vault 11's sealing created something that the other Vault sealings, for all their various cruelties and experimental designs, did not create in quite the same way. It created a world whose specific organizing principle was announced before the shock of sealing had fully resolved into the beginnings of adaptation. A world whose fundamental rule was communicated to its inhabitants in the specific voice of the overseer computer, while the reality of their sealed condition was still new enough to be felt as catastrophe rather than as simply the permanent condition of their existence. The community that received this announcement was not a community that had been selected for any particular vulnerability to the specific institutional pressure the announcement described. They were the people who had made it to the Vault, the combination of those whose pre-war resources or connections or simple luck had secured them a place in the shelter they had been told would protect them from the nuclear exchange, and the specific character of their community in the hours and days following the sealing reflected the specific character of the pre-war world they had come from. The social patterns and the authority structures and the emotional frameworks that they had brought through the Vault's door with them as surely as the physical possessions the space restrictions permitted. They were frightened in the specific way of people who had just witnessed or fled the destruction of the world they knew. They were relieved in the specific way of people who had survived something that many of the people they cared about had not survived. They were uncertain in the specific way of people who understood that the world above was gone, but did not yet have a coherent picture of what the world below was going to be. Into this specific emotional and social condition, the acute vulnerability of a traumatized community. In the earliest hours of its sealed existence, the overseer computer delivered the announcement that would organize every subsequent dimension of the community's life. The specific content of the announcement, as the Vault's documentary record preserves it, was not presented in the language of threat or of punishment, but in the language of institutional necessity. The flat procedural tone of an administrative communication describing a requirement whose existence was simply a feature of the Vault's design, rather than a policy whose specific terms had been chosen by anyone who could be held responsible for them. One resident must be sacrificed each year. The community would determine, through its own processes, which resident that would be. Failure to deliver the annual sacrifice would result in the Vault's automated systems ending the lives of all residents. These were not presented as choices, but as parameters, not as policies that could be revised through community decision-making, but as the fixed conditions of the sealed environment that the community now inhabited. The immediate response that this announcement produced in the founding community is documented only partially in the Vault's surviving records. But what the records do preserve is sufficient to establish the general character of the community's initial engagement with the rule and the specific ways in which the shock of the announcement was processed through the social, psychological frameworks that the founding generation had brought from the surface. There was disbelief, the specific form of cognitive resistance that the human mind deploys when presented with information whose implications are too extreme to be immediately integrated into the existing framework of understanding, the conviction that the announcement must have been misunderstood, or that it described a requirement that would prove to be theoretical rather than actual, that some subsequent communication would clarify that the sacrifice was symbolic rather than literal, or that some alternative compliance mechanism existed that the initial announcement had not described. There was horror, the more direct emotional response of people who had understood the announcement correctly, and whose understanding produced the specific quality of existential dread that the realization of permanent institutional entrapment in a life or death system generates in those who grasp its full implications without the defense of denial. And there was, alongside both of these, the specific, pragmatic orientation of people who understood that the announcement's terms were real and who had already begun, consciously or not, the process of thinking about how to survive within them. The founding community's social character in the period before the lottery's first operation was the social character of a pre-war American civilian community in the specific circumstances of acute collective trauma. Sealed confinement, a character that combined the genuine mutual support that shared catastrophe often produces with the specific social hierarchies and the specific interpersonal tensions and the specific cultural frameworks that the pre-war world had established in the people who carried them into the Vault. The relationships that formed and reformed in the Vault's earliest weeks were relationships shaped by proximity and by shared experience, and by the specific emotional intensity of people who had lost the world they knew and who were discovering the world they now inhabited simultaneously. The community that emerged from this period was not a community without genuine solidarity or genuine care. The evidence suggests that the founding generation maintained something approaching the ideals of communal responsibility and mutual protection across the Vault's earliest years in ways that the subsequent decades would progressively erode. But it was also not a community free of the specific social divisions and personal conflicts that pre-war American social life had produced in the people who constituted it. And those divisions and conflicts were the specific fault lines along which the lottery's pressure would eventually produce the fractures that the corruption required. The first sacrifice was the event that determined more about the Vault's subsequent history than any other single moment in its founding period, because the first sacrifice was the moment at which the abstract institutional requirement became a specific concrete reality, the moment at which the community's choices about how to manage the annual sacrifice requirement produced their first irreversible human consequence. The specific process through which the community arrived at a decision about who would be the first victim is the process that established the precedents whose path dependence shaped every subsequent year's decision-making. The specific combination of argument and social pressure and emotional appeal and practical calculation that produced the first selection, becoming the framework within which subsequent selections would be negotiated and understood. The community that had spent the period between the announcement and the first selection arguing about whether the requirement was real, about whether collective resistance was possible, about whether the overseer computer's threat was a bluff that could be called, this community had arrived, by the time the first selection was required, at the consensus that the requirement was real and that its terms would be honored. And the specific character of that consensus and the specific social dynamics through which it had been reached were the foundation on which the lottery's subsequent development was built. The original concept of the lottery as the mechanism for managing the annual selection emerged from the specific moral logic of a community that was attempting to maintain something of the ethical framework it had brought from the surface, in the face of an institutional requirement that framework had no established resources for accommodating. The argument for the lottery was the argument for fairness in the specific situation where fairness required the equal distribution of an unbearable burden, the recognition that if someone had to be sacrificed each year, the most defensible single principle for determining who that someone would be was a principle that gave every community member equal probability of selection, that did not privilege any individual or group over any other, that made the sacrifice requirement's annual cost a risk that was shared rather than concentrated. This was not an argument that made the sacrifice requirement acceptable. Nothing could make it acceptable, but it was an argument that made the specific mechanism of selection defensible in terms that the community's surviving moral framework could accommodate, and the appeal of that defensibility was sufficient to produce a consensus around the lottery concept that the alternative approaches, direct selection by community vote, rotation by some criterion of vulnerability or social contribution, voluntary sacrifice, could not generate. The lottery's first operation was an event whose specific procedural character established the ritual form that subsequent years' lotteries would follow, with the modifications that each year's specific social and political circumstances imposed. The gathering of the community, the physical mechanism of the selection, the drum or the drawn names, or whatever specific procedural form the founding community had improvised, from the resources available, the announcement of the result, the community's response to the person whose name had been drawn, the specific process by which the selection was honored and the sacrifice delivered to the sacrificial chamber. These were not simply administrative procedures, but the specific ritual forms through which the community was collectively enacting its accommodation to the institutional reality that the vault's design had imposed. Every person who participated in the lottery's first operation, who added their name to the pool, who witnessed the selection, who honored the result without organized resistance, was participating in the creation of the institutional precedent that would govern the vault's social life for the duration of its sealed existence, was contributing their individual compliance to the collective compliance that made the lottery a real institution, rather than simply a proposed mechanism whose viability had not yet been tested. The founding overseer's specific relationship with the lottery's establishment was the relationship of a person whose institutional position required them to serve simultaneously as the community's governance authority and as the administrator of the mechanism that was killing members of the community they governed. The specific tension this dual role created was not simply a personal psychological burden, but a structural feature of the overseer position that would shape every subsequent occupant's experience of the role, the impossibility of maintaining the kind of legitimate governing authority that the community's welfare required, while also administering an institution whose specific operation required the community's regular death toll. The founding overseer's choices about how to navigate this tension, whether to embrace the lottery's administration as part of the institutional responsibility the position required, whether to maintain a performative distance from the lottery's operation while ensuring its practical functioning, whether to attempt any form of resistance to the institutional requirement that the overseer computer had imposed established patterns whose influence on subsequent overseers was transmitted through the specific institutional culture that the Vault's governance traditions preserved. The psychological impact of the Vault's founding years on its community was the impact of a population being formed into something different from what it had been by the specific experience of institutionalized annual death, not the acute psychological damage of a singular traumatic event, but the specific long-term psychological modification that sustained exposure to a chronic institutional stressor produces in the people whose lives are organized around it. The community members who had been adults at Sealing were people whose psychological development had been completed in a world where the annual sacrifice requirement did not exist, who were therefore capable of maintaining a clear sense of the contrast between the world they had known and the world the Vault had produced, and who found in that contrast the specific resources for moral clarity that subsequent Vault-born generations would not have available to them. They remembered a world in which no one was required to be sacrificed each year, in which the specific institutional arrangement that now governed their lives was absent. And that memory provided them with the comparative framework to understand what the lottery's existence represented as a departure from the moral baseline of human social organization. The children born within the Vault were the people who lacked this comparative framework in the most fundamental sense, who had been formed entirely within the world the Vault had created, and for whom the annual sacrifice requirement was not a departure from a remembered baseline, but simply a feature of the world as they had always known it. The specific psychological and moral development of children raised within the Vault's sealed environment was the development of people for whom the lottery's existence was as natural as the Vault's recycled air and its artificial lighting, for whom the annual selection was a feature of the social calendar rather than an emergency whose resolution required extraordinary measures, and whose understanding of what was normal and what was exceptional in human social organization was therefore organized around a baseline that the founding generation's surface memories would have recognized as catastrophically distorted. These Vault-born residents were not morally different in kind from the founding generation. They were not less capable of moral understanding or moral resistance than people raised on the surface would have been, but they were morally different in their specific starting conditions, in the specific framework within which their moral education had occurred, and within which the claims and the counterclaims about the lottery's justice and its corruption would be evaluated. The transmission of the lottery's specific institutional culture from the founding generation to the Vault-born generation was the most consequential single act of cultural transmission in the Vault's history, because it was through this transmission that the lottery's specific moral status was established for the people who would eventually determine the Vault's political future. How the founding generation described the lottery to their children, whether as a terrible necessity or as a genuine injustice, as an institution whose specific terms were fixed, or as an arrangement whose specific features were the product of choices that could in principle have been made differently, shaped the moral framework within which the subsequent generations understood their own relationship to the institution and their own capacity to change it. The evidence suggests that the transmission was not uniform, that some founding generation members communicated their moral understanding of the lottery in terms that preserved its status as an injustice, while others communicated it in terms that had already begun the process of normalization, the gradual conversion of the extraordinary into the ordinary that the Vault's decades of sealed operation were progressively accomplishing in the community's collective moral understanding. The specific fragilities in the Vault's founding period that the lottery's pressure would eventually exploit were not the fragilities of an exceptionally weak or exceptionally corrupt community, but the fragilities of any human community placed in the specific institutional conditions that the Vault's design had created, the fragility of social solidarity under conditions of annually renewed existential threat, the fragility of procedural fairness in the absence of the external enforcement mechanisms that give procedural rules their binding force in normal social conditions, and the fragility of individual moral courage in the face of collective accommodation, whose abandonment required not simply the willingness to accept personal risk, but the capacity to organize sufficient social support for resistance to be effective rather than simply suicidal. These fragilities were present from the Vault's earliest years, built into the specific character of the institutional situation, rather than introduced by the specific moral failures of specific individuals, and their eventual exploitation by the factional actors whose emergence the subsequent decades produced was not a betrayal of the founding community's values so much as the specific outcome that the institutional environment's specific design made increasingly likely as the years of sealed existence accumulated and the community's social and political landscape developed in the specific directions that the lottery's annual pressure reliably drove it. The normalization of institutionalized death is not a process that happens quickly or cleanly or with the conscious awareness of the people in whom it is occurring. And what Vault 11's history documents about this process is its specific character as a gradual and largely invisible transformation of the community's collective moral understanding, a transformation whose individual steps were each too small to clearly mark the specific moment at which accommodation had progressed from a reasonable response to an unreasonable situation into an unreasonable response that was itself a form of complicity in the institution's ongoing operation. The community did not decide to normalize the lottery. It accumulated decisions about how to manage the specific challenges that each year's lottery operation presented, and the aggregate of those decisions across the years of sealed existence was a community whose relationship with the lottery's moral status had been progressively modified by the cumulative weight of its own compliance history in ways that made active resistance progressively less psychologically and socially available as an option for the people whose compliance history had helped produce the normalized condition they now inhabited. The ritual elaborations that developed around the lottery's annual operation were the most visible expressions of this normalization process, because ritual is the mechanism through which human communities convert extraordinary events into ordinary ones, through which the specific forms and procedures of an activity acquire the taken-for-granted quality of established practice, and through which participation in the activity becomes a form of community identity expression rather than simply a response to an external requirement. The lottery procedures that the founding community had improvised under emergency conditions became, through repetition and through the specific institutional weight that repeated practice accumulates, established procedures whose specific forms were maintained not because the community had chosen them as optimal, but because they were what the lottery had always looked like. And the specific familiarity of their established forms made deviation from them feel like a departure from institutional legitimacy rather than simply a modification of administrative practice. The drum, if it was a drum, the drawing, if it was a drawing, the announcement, the witness, the delivery, these became the specific procedural vocabulary through which the community enacted its annual compliance with the sacrifice requirement, and their familiarity was itself a mechanism of normalization, a way of making the annual death feel like a known and managed event rather than a catastrophe. The overseer's role in the lottery's administration became progressively more central to the overseer's institutional identity across the Vault's early decades. As the annual lottery operation moved from an emergency, the overseer managed to a regular institutional function. The overseer administered, and the specific character of the overseer position's relationship with the lottery shaped the specific quality of authority that successive overseers exercised over the broader community's governance. The overseers, who were most effective at managing the lottery's operation, who could navigate the annual cycle of selection and sacrifice with the procedural efficiency and the emotional management that maintaining community stability required, were the overseers, whose institutional authority was most completely defined by their lottery administration function. And this definition of the overseer's authority in terms of lottery management was the institutional development that would eventually make the overseer position a prize worth competing for in the specific terms of the lotteries. Factional politics. Because controlling the overseer's lottery administration function was a pathway to controlling the lottery's outcomes in ways that could not be achieved through the community's general social and political dynamics alone. The generation that came to maturity in the Vault's middle decades was the generation that would develop the factional politics, whose specific operations the Vault's most extensively preserved records document, and the specific character of their moral and social formation was the character of people for whom the lottery's normalization was the most complete, who had been raised in a community whose collective moral understanding had already processed the initial shock of the requirement and arrived at the specific, accommodated relationship with it that the founding generation's years of compliance had produced, who therefore did not have available to them even the attenuated comparative moral framework that the founding generation's surface memories provided. For these Vault-born residents, the question was not whether the lottery should exist. The question of existence had been settled by the compliance history they had inherited, but how the lottery's specific operation could be managed in ways that protected the specific people they cared about and exposed the specific people they did not care about or actively opposed. This was not a morally comfortable position, and the people who occupied it were not morally comfortable with it. The Vault's records preserve evidence of the specific discomfort and the specific self-justifications and the specific moral rationalizations that the individuals who developed the factional protection strategies deployed in their own internal accounting of what they were doing and why. But it was the position that the institutional environment had made the most practically rational one available. And the specific ways in which it was rational were the ways that the Vault's experimental design had been organized to produce. The specific threshold at which the lottery's operation shifted from formally fair to functionally corrupt was not a single identifiable moment, but the accumulation of the specific smaller decisions whose aggregate produced the corruption the first time a community member used social pressure to steer the selection process towards someone they had reason to want removed. The first time the overseer's administration of the lottery reflected factional influence rather than procedural neutrality. The first time the Vault's established social hierarchy was reproduced in the lottery's outcomes in ways that the random selection mechanism could not have produced without deliberate interference. Each of these specific developments was the product of specific people making specific choices in specific circumstances, whose individual character made the choice feel more defensible than the aggregate it contributed to. And the accumulation of these choices across the Vault's middle decades was the process through which a lottery that was terrible in its existence, but fair in its operation, became a lottery that was both terrible in its existence and corrupt in its operation, adding the specific injustice of deliberate manipulation to the already existing injustice of the annual requirement itself. The factions that organized the Vault's political life in the period of the lottery's most thoroughly documented operation were not simple criminal enterprises or explicit conspiracies against the community's welfare. They were the specific political forms that emerged when ordinary human social behavior, the formation of alliances, the development of mutual protection arrangements, the organization of collective interest around specific shared concerns, was applied to the specific institutional environment that the lottery's existence created. The Justice Bloc, whose records are most extensively preserved in the Vault's terminal entries, understood itself not as a faction whose purpose was the corruption of the lottery, but as a political organization whose purpose was the protection of its members and the reform of the Vault's governance. And the specific self-understanding that its records reveal was not simply cynical rationalization, but reflected the genuine institutional complexity of a political organization that was simultaneously a response to the lottery's injustice and a participant in the specific system of factional competition that the lottery's existence had produced. The specific origins of the Justice Block can be reconstructed from the terminal entries that its members and its adversaries created across the period of its operation. And what the reconstruction reveals is the specific character of a political organization that emerged from the intersection of genuine grievance and practical political calculation, from the experience of specific individuals whose personal losses in the lottery had produced the motivation for political organization, combined with the recognition of specific political actors, that the lottery's operation was a resource whose control could provide the kind of institutional leverage that was otherwise unavailable in the Vault's constrained political environment. The individuals who founded the Justice Block were not the Vault's most politically experienced or most socially powerful members. They were people whose relationship with the lottery had been transformed by personal experience of its specific injustice, from passive accommodation to active political engagement, and whose specific skills and social networks provided them with the organizing resources that active political engagement required. The broader factional landscape beyond the Justice Block was the landscape of the specific political organizations that the Justice Block's rise had produced, both as allies and as adversaries, the other organized groups whose competing interests in the lottery's operation generated the specific political conflict, whose documentation constitutes the most extensive surviving record of Vault 11's social history. The specific names and the specific membership bases and the specific political programs of these various factions are documented with varying degrees of completeness in the Vault's terminal entries, but the general pattern of their operation is consistent enough across the available evidence to establish the character of the factional landscape as a whole, a landscape in which each significant organized group had developed its own specific approach to the lottery's management, its own specific understanding of which community members deserved protection and which could acceptably be exposed to the lottery's selection, and its own specific set of practical techniques for translating that understanding into actual influence over the lottery's outcomes. The overseer position's role within this factional landscape was the role of the most important single prize in the Vault's political competition, the institutional office whose control provided the most direct access to the lottery's administration, and therefore the most complete form of factional protection that the Vault's political environment made available. The specific ways in which successive overseers were selected, the specific factional alliances whose support made particular overseer candidacies viable and whose opposition made others impossible, and the specific obligations that factional support created for the overseers whose selection it enabled. These were the political dynamics whose understanding was essential for anyone seeking to navigate the Vault's factional landscape with any degree of sophistication, and whose specific character in each successive overseer selection cycle reveals the specific state of the factional balance of power at that particular moment in the Vault's political history. The unaffiliated residents, the community members, who were not members of any recognized faction, and who therefore did not have access to the specific forms of lottery protection that factional membership provided, occupied the community, the most vulnerable position in the Vault's social landscape, and the specific character of their vulnerability illuminates the specific nature of the injustice that the factional lottery system produced. These were not necessarily the Vault's least capable or least socially connected members. Unaffiliated status could reflect principled refusal of factional participation as much as social marginalization, and the Vault's records preserve evidence of both types. But whatever the specific reason for their unaffiliated status, the practical consequence was the same: an elevated probability of lottery selection that reflected not random chance, but the specific political calculations of factional actors who needed to satisfy the annual requirement without exposing their own members, and who found, in the unaffiliated population, the most practically available pool of victims whose sacrifice would accomplish this without triggering the specific forms of factional retaliation that the sacrifice of a member of a rival faction might produce. The moral self-justifications that the factional actors deployed in their own accounting of their lottery manipulation activities were the specific moral arguments that the institutional environment's specific features made most readily available, and their character reveals the specific mechanisms of motivated reasoning that the vault's conditions had developed in the community's political actors. The argument from protection, the claim that the faction's lottery manipulation was justified by the specific obligation of protection that factional membership created, that the choice was not between manipulation and fairness, but between manipulation in service of your own members' protection and manipulation in service of rival factions. Members' protection was the most common single form of factional self-justification in the available record, and its prevalence reveals the specific way in which the vault's institutional environment had transformed the moral question of lottery fairness from a question about the community's collective obligations to a question about the faction's specific obligations to its own membership. The community's welfare was not absent from these moral calculations. The factional actors' terminal entries and holotapes do not suggest people who had simply abandoned any concern for the community as a whole, but it had been redefined in ways that made the community's welfare compatible with the factional manipulation that was undermining the community's most fundamental institutional commitment to distributing the sacrifice. Requirements, annual cost, fairly across its full membership. What the factional landscape's development across the vault's middle decades produced, in aggregate, was a political environment in which the lottery's original fairness claim had been so thoroughly undermined by the specific operations of factional competition that the word lottery no longer accurately described what the annual selection process was accomplishing. The drum still turned, the names were still drawn, the procedures that the founding community had established still provided the ritual framework within which the annual selection was performed. But the specific outcomes that the ritual produced were not the random distribution of sacrifice risk that the lottery's fairness claim required. They were the specific distribution of sacrifice risk that the factional balance of power at any given moment produced, a distribution that systematically concentrated the sacrifice burden on the vault's most politically vulnerable residents, while systematically protecting the members of the organized factions whose political capabilities were sufficient to translate social power into lottery protection. The gap between the ritual's claimed fairness and its actual operation was the specific form of institutional dishonesty that the vault's political life had organized itself around, and the specific character of that gap, maintained through the combined efforts of multiple competing factions, whose manipulation of the lottery was the primary content of their political competition, was the foundation on which Catherine Stone's story and the rebellion's story and the vault's final resolution would eventually be built. The administrative vulnerabilities in any institutional procedure are the specific places where the procedure's design requires human judgment to supplement mechanical process, where the gap between the written rule and its application in specific circumstances creates space for the exercise of discretion that the rule's designers either did not anticipate or deliberately left unaddressed. In a vault whose population was small enough that every community member knew every other community member by name and by face and by social position, and whose lottery procedure was administered by people who were themselves members of the community they were administering it for, the gap between the written rule and its application in specific circumstances was not simply a procedural vulnerability, but the primary arena of the lottery's political life, the specific space within which the factional actors' competing interests were translated into actual influence over the selection outcomes that the lottery's formal procedure was nominally producing through random chance. Understanding how this translation occurred in practice requires examining the specific features of the lottery's procedural architecture with the attention to operational detail that the general analysis of factional politics does not provide, because the specific mechanisms of rigging were as important as the general political conditions that motivated and enabled them. And the specific character of those mechanisms reveals things about both the vault's institutional design and its political culture that the broader analysis alone cannot establish. The lottery's voting mechanisms, whatever specific form the community had established for the formal input of selections into the annual process, were the most direct single pathway through which factional influence could be converted into lottery outcomes. And the specific techniques of vote manipulation that the vault's factional actors developed reflected both the specific vulnerabilities of the voting architecture and the specific social and psychological resources that the factional actors had available for their exploitation. The proxy control of other community members' votes was the most extensively documented form of vote manipulation in the vault's surviving records, and the specific mechanisms through which proxy control was established and maintained illuminate the specific character of the social relationships that the lottery's institutional pressure had produced in the vault community at the level of individual interaction. Proxy control was not simply coercion, was not simply the use of superior physical force or explicit threat to compel another community member to vote in a specified way. Though the available evidence does not exclude the possibility that explicit coercion was employed in specific cases whose documentation is less complete than the general pattern of proxy control, the records reveal. It was more commonly the specific combination of social obligation, economic dependency, and emotional manipulation that the vault's constrained social environment made available as tools of influence, deployed by people whose factional position gave them both the motivation to seek proxy control and the specific social resources to exercise it effectively. The economic dependencies that the vault's constrained resource environment had produced between community members were among the most reliable foundations for proxy control, because they created specific obligations whose satisfaction could be conditioned on compliance with specific voting preferences, without the explicit transactional character of that conditioning needing to be stated in terms that would make the manipulation's nature visible in the documentary record or in the social consciousness of the broader community. The community member who controlled access to specific scarce resources, particular foods, medical supplies, specific technical services, access to the more desirable living spaces, was in a position to make the availability of those resources contingent on compliance with their factional preferences in ways that their dependents understood without requiring explicit statement. And the specific form of the understanding was such that both parties could maintain the fiction of the relationship's non-transactional character, even while both parties were fully aware of the specific transaction that the relationship was actually encoding. This kind of deniable coercion was the most sustainable form of proxy control in the vault's social environment, because it was the form that could be maintained across multiple lottery cycles without the explicit confrontation that more direct forms of pressure would eventually produce. And its sustainability across multiple cycles was what made it so valuable as a factional tool. The social obligations that factional membership created were a second major pathway through which proxy control was exercised, one that operated less through explicit calculation and more through the specific dynamics of group loyalty and reciprocal obligation that any organized social group develops among its members. The faction member whose lottery protection depended on the collective action of the faction's other members was a person whose social identity and practical survival were both bound up in the maintenance of factional solidarity, and whose voting behavior in the annual lottery was therefore shaped not simply by fear of explicit punishment for defection, but by the specific social psychology of someone who understood that their individual welfare was inseparable from the collective welfare of the group, and whose loyalty to the group was therefore a rational expression of self-interest as much as an emotional expression of genuine belonging. The factional leaders who managed these loyalty dynamics were managing something more complex and more durable than simple coercion. They were managing the specific intersection of self-interest and social identity that makes group membership a genuine motivational force rather than simply a calculated arrangement, and their management of this intersection gave them a form of proxy control over their members' voting behavior that was both more complete and more resilient than coercion alone could have produced. The overseer nomination process was the most institutionally significant single arena of factional competition in the Vault's political life, and understanding its specific operation as a manipulation vector requires understanding the specific ways in which the overseer's formal administrative role in the lottery's operation translated into practical influence over the lottery's outcomes. The overseer did not select the lottery's victims. The formal procedure for that selection was nominally independent of the overseer's direct control, maintained through whatever combination of mechanical randomness and procedural oversight the founding community had established. But the overseer's administrative position gave them specific forms of access and influence over the lottery's operation that, in the hands of someone with the factional motivation to exploit them, could translate procedural access into outcome influence with a thoroughness that the formal procedure's nominal independence did not prevent. The overseer controlled the timing of specific procedural steps, whose timing had implications for which community members were present and eligible at the moment of selection. The overseer managed the documentation of lottery eligibility, whose specific terms determined whose names were included in the pool and whose were excluded on the basis of whatever criteria the community's rules had established. The overseer adjudicated the specific procedural disputes that the annual lottery's operation inevitably produced, and the specific ways in which those disputes were resolved had cumulative effects on the lottery's operation that individual adjudications did not make fully visible. These specific forms of administrative influence were the resources that made the overseer nomination a prize worth competing for in the specific terms of factional politics, and the competition for overseer nominations was conducted with the full intensity that the prize's value merited. The specific dynamics of overseer nomination competitions in the Vault's middle decades reveal the factional landscape's specific character with more clarity than almost any other documented aspect of the Vault's political life, because the nomination competitions were the specific occasions on which the various factions' relative power and the specific alliances and enmities between them were most directly tested against each other and most completely revealed in the documentary record that the terminal entries preserve. The faction that could secure the overseer position was the faction whose lottery manipulation capabilities were most completely realized, whose members had access to the broadest range of administrative tools for shaping the lottery's outcomes, and whose rivals faced the greatest concentration of procedural disadvantage. The faction that lost the overseer competition was the faction whose members faced the highest lottery risk in the subsequent cycle, because the losing faction's adversaries would now control the administrative mechanisms through which outcome influence could be most directly exercised, and the losing faction's members would have to rely on the less complete protection that social and political manipulation alone could provide in the absence of administrative access. The information asymmetries that factional membership created in the Vault's lottery-related social life were a dimension of factional advantage that the available records document less systematically than the direct vote, manipulation, and administrative influence, but whose practical significance for the lottery's actual outcomes was not less important for being less visible in the documentation. The specific intelligence about the lottery's likely targets that circulated within factional networks, the informal knowledge about which community members were being considered as potential selections by the factional actors, with influence over the process, the advance awareness of specific procedural developments whose implications for particular individuals' lottery risk the general community did not yet understand, gave factional members a form of protective advantage that their unaffiliated neighbors could not access, regardless of their individual social capabilities or personal resources. Knowing in advance that you were likely to be selected in the current cycle's lottery gave you time to develop and deploy whatever protective strategies from your social position made available to activate the specific relationships and obligations that might provide some degree of protection, to remove yourself from situations of procedural vulnerability, to organize the specific social and political responses that might complicate the selection or make it politically costly enough to redirect toward a less well-connected target. This advanced knowledge was not a guarantee of protection, but it was a significant advantage in the specific game of lottery avoidance that every vault resident was always playing, and the factional distribution of this advantage was one of the most important single mechanisms through which factional membership translated into reduced lottery risk for the people who possessed it. The social pressure and pre-selection techniques that operated alongside the formal manipulation of the lottery's procedural mechanisms were the informal complement to the formal corruption, the specific ways in which the factional actors shaped individual community members' behavior and social positioning in the period leading up to the annual lottery in ways that made formal manipulation less necessary because the social environment had already been arranged to produce the outcomes the factional actors desired. The specific techniques of informal pre-selection were as varied as the specific social resources that the Vault's various factional actors had available for their deployment, and their common feature was the conversion of the Vault's constrained social environment, the impossibility of exit, the inescapability of ongoing social relationships with everyone, the Vault contained into a tool of social pressure whose effectiveness in a sealed community exceeded anything that the same techniques could have accomplished in the open social environments of the pre-war world. The community member who was being pre-selected as a likely lottery victim would experience the pre-selection not as a formal announcement of their status, but as a specific pattern of social withdrawal and relational cooling that communicated their vulnerability without stating it explicitly, a pattern whose reading required the specific social fluency that Vault life had developed in its long-term residence, but whose implications, once read, were as clear as any formal notification could have been. The specific patterns in the lottery's outcomes across the years of factional control are the most direct available evidence for the specific character of the injustice that the rigged lottery produced, because the outcomes are the place where the political dynamics and the administrative manipulations and the social pressure and the information asymmetries all converge in the specific result that the community's annual sacrifice requirement was satisfied through the specific person whose death fulfilled the institutional obligation for that year, and whose specific social position relative to the Vault's factional landscape determined whether their selection reflected the genuine random chance that the lottery's founding principle required, or the specific factional calculations that the corruption had substituted for it. The pattern that emerges from the available records is not surprising, given the general analysis of the factional dynamics that produced it. The Vault's annual sacrifices fell disproportionately on the community members whose social and political positions were weakest, whose factional protections were least complete, whose specific circumstances made them the most practically available pool of victims for the factional actors who needed to satisfy the annual requirement without exposing their own members to the lottery's selection. The unaffiliated, the politically marginal, the people whose specific personal histories had produced social vulnerabilities that the factional actors could exploit. These were the community members who bore the accumulated burden of the lottery's factional corruption and the specific concentration of sacrifice burden in this specific population was the concrete human cost of the institutional dishonesty that the factional lottery represented. The documentation of the rigging in the vault's surviving terminal entries and holotapes is the documentation of a community that both knew and did not know what it was doing. Knew in the sense that specific individuals were creating records whose content establishes the rigging's specific operations with a clarity that cannot be explained by anything other than direct knowledge of the manipulation, and did not know in the sense that the community as a whole appears to have maintained a collective fiction about the lottery's operation, whose specific character, not a lie that anyone was actively telling, but a silence that everyone was actively maintaining, was itself one of the most revealing features of the vault's social psychology. The people who created records documenting the rigging were not primarily doing so as acts of moral witness or institutional accountability. They were creating records for the specific purposes that records serve in a politically active community: the documentation of factional agreements and factional disputes, and the specific transactions through which power was accumulated and exercised. The fact that this documentation incidentally established the rigging's specific operations was a byproduct of the record's primary purposes rather than their intent, and the fact that this documentation existed alongside the community's collective fiction about the lottery's fairness reveals the specific quality of the vault's social epistemology, a community that knew what it was doing at the level of specific individual actors and did not know what it was doing at the level of collective self-understanding, that maintained simultaneously the factional actors' specific knowledge of the manipulation and the community's general nominal commitment to the lottery's fairness principle. Catherine Stone's name appears in Vault 11's documentary record in the specific way that the most important characters in any institutional history appear not as the protagonist of a narrative whose significance is immediately clear, but as a participant in specific documented events whose significance becomes apparent only when the full context of the vault's political history is understood, and her specific trajectory within that history can be traced from its beginning through its most complete expression. She was not, in the period before the lottery claimed her husband, a particularly prominent figure in the vault's factional politics, was not the kind of person whose record of institutional participation suggests the specific combination of political ambition and social calculation that the vault's factional actors who shaped the lottery's operation most completely possessed. She was a community member whose specific social position, her relationships, her factional affiliations or lack thereof, her specific standing within the vault's social hierarchy had been sufficient to protect her from the lottery's direct consequences in the years before her husband's selection, but had not been sufficient to protect the person whose survival she cared about most, and the specific gap between her own survival and her husband's sacrifice was the gap through which the specific transformation that the vault's records document occurred. The selection of Catherine Stone's husband was, the available evidence strongly suggests, not the product of genuine random chance, but of the specific factional calculations that had been converting the lottery's procedural mechanisms into instruments of political targeting across the vault's middle decades. The specific circumstances of his selection, the political context within which it occurred, the specific factional dynamics that were active in the relevant period, the available evidence about his specific social and political position within the vault's community all point toward a selection that reflected the factional actor's specific interest in removing someone whose position was either a threat to be eliminated or a vulnerability to be exploited, rather than the random chance that the lottery's nominal procedures were supposed to produce. Whether Catherine Stone understood this at the moment of her husband's selection, or arrived at that understanding through the specific process of grief and investigation and political engagement that followed his death, is a question. The available records do not definitively resolve, but the trajectory of her subsequent actions suggests a person whose response to loss included not simply grief, but the specific analytical clarity that sometimes accompanies extreme emotional pain, the stripping away of the social fictions whose maintenance required the expenditure of psychological resources that grief temporarily makes unavailable. The transformation that Catherine Stone's loss produced in her relationship with the Vault's political life was the transformation of a person who had been operating within the Vault's social framework, accepting its nominal commitments and its actual operations, with the specific combination of passive knowledge and active compliance that ordinary Vault community membership required into a person who had decided to engage with the Vault's political framework on its actual terms rather than its nominal ones, to deploy the specific social and political resources available to her in the specific game whose rules the factional actors had established, rather than in the game whose rules the lottery's founding principles described. This was not, it should be understood, simply an emotional response to personal loss, whose irrationality could be explained by the specific intensity of grief. It was a rational response to the specific institutional conditions that the Vault's political environment had created, a decision to participate in the factional manipulation whose specific operations had claimed her husband, rather than to continue accepting the position of a non-participant in a game whose outcomes were being determined without her input and at her expense. The specific manipulation techniques that Catherine Stone employed in her engagement with the Vault's lottery system reflect both the specific social resources that her particular position within the community gave her access to, the specific vulnerabilities in the lottery's administrative and social architecture that her post-loss analytical engagement with the Vault's political reality had identified. She was not the most powerful factional actor in the Vault's political landscape, and the specific protections that her manipulation provided were not as comprehensive or as durable as those that the established faction's longer-term engagement with the system had developed. But she was effective in the specific, limited sense that the available evidence establishes effective at redirecting at least some portion of the lottery's selection pressure towards specific individuals whose selection served her specific purposes, effective at accumulating the specific forms of social and political influence that the Vault's factional economy made available to people willing to engage with it on its actual terms, effective at navigating the specific intersection of grief and political calculation that the Vault's institutional environment had made the primary emotional and intellectual challenge of her post-loss life. The moral accounting of Catherine Stone's specific actions is the moral accounting of someone whose behavior cannot be evaluated without attention to the specific institutional conditions that produced it, and the specific difficulty of that accounting is itself one of the most important things that her story reveals about the Vault's moral landscape. The factional actors whose manipulation of the lottery had claimed her husband were not morally distinct in the general character of their behavior from Catherine Stone's subsequent manipulation of the same system. They were doing the same kind of thing for the same kind of reasons, deploying social and political resources to redirect the lottery's selection pressure toward targets they found acceptable while protecting people they cared about or whose protection served their factional interests. The specific moral distinction between her manipulation and theirs, if one exists, is not a distinction of kind, but of the specific moral weight that the circumstances of her entry into the manipulation game carry. The fact that she arrived at manipulation through victimization rather than through the gradual normalization that had drawn the established factional actors into their roles, the fact that her specific motivation was revenge and grief, rather than the more diffuse self-interest and factional loyalty that organized the established faction's manipulation. Whether this distinction in the circumstances and motivations of entry into manipulation constitutes a morally meaningful distinction in the manipulation itself is the question that the Vault's records pose without resolving, and the irresolvability of the question is a feature of the institutional moral landscape rather than a failure of the available evidence. Catherine Stone's trajectory from victim to manipulator was not unique. In Vault 11's history, the available evidence suggests that the specific path of personal loss, followed by factional engagement and lottery, manipulation was one of the primary mechanisms through which the Vault's factional landscape reproduced itself across generations. That the experience of losing someone to the rigged lottery was one of the most reliable single pathways into the active political engagement that factional participation required. The Vault was producing its own manipulators through its own operation was creating, through each year's factional selection of victims, the specific individuals whose post-loss transformation would bring them into the factional landscape as new participants in the manipulation that had victimized them, adding their specific social resources and their specific grievances to the factional ecosystem that the lottery had built, and that the lottery's continued operation was continuously recruiting to sustain. This self-reproducing quality of the Vault's factional politics was perhaps the most important single feature of the institutional dynamic that made the lottery's corruption so durable, not simply that the manipulation was difficult to resist from outside the factional system, but that the factional system was continuously generating new participants from the population of its own victims, converting the specific people most motivated to oppose the system into the specific people most likely to join it. The Vault that had survived its founding period and its middle decades, and the accumulation of every specific factional compromise, and every specific lottery manipulation, and every specific Catherine Stone, was not the Vault that the Price Overseer Computer's announcement had called into being. It was something that had been made from that original community through the specific processes of institutional adaptation and moral accommodation and political corruption that the decades of sealed existence under the lotteries pressure had produced something that retained the physical and procedural forms of the founding community's social arrangements, while having transformed their moral content so completely that the forms now served purposes and expressed values that the founding community's framework would not have recognized as continuous with its own. The social character of the Vault in the period of the lottery's most complete corruption was the social character of a community that had organized its entire relational life around the specific variable of lottery risk, in which every significant interpersonal relationship was shaped by the question of what the other person's factional position meant for your own probability of selection, and what your own factional position meant for theirs. The friendships that existed in the Vault's corrupted middle period were friendships whose specific warmth and whose specific limits were both shaped by this organizing variable, genuine in the ways that human connection is always genuine when it occurs between people sharing an extreme situation, and constrained in the ways that connection is always constrained when the institutional environment has made every potential friend simultaneously a potential competitor for the scarce resource of survival. The family relationships that persisted in the Vault were family relationships whose specific emotional texture had been modified by the lottery's presence. The specific way that parents related to children was the way of parents who understood that they might need to deploy every social resource they possessed to protect their children from the lottery's selection, whose parental love was therefore inseparable from a specific political calculation about what that love's protection required in the Vault's factional environment. The specific moral compromises that ordinary Vault membership required in the period of maximum corruption were not primarily the dramatic moral compromises of the factional leaders, whose specific manipulation of the lottery is most extensively documented in the surviving records. They were the smaller and more pervasive moral compromises of ordinary community membership, the complicity of people who knew that the lottery was rigged and did not organize effective resistance to it, who cast their votes in the annual procedure knowing that the procedure's outcome had been predetermined by factional manipulation, who witnessed the selection of this year's victim and understood that the selection reflected the vault's factional politics rather than the random chance the lottery's nominal procedure claimed to produce, and who honored the selection rather than organizing the collective resistance that would have been required to challenge it. These were not people who were simply ignorant of the manipulation. The vault's small community and its long shared history meant that the manipulation's existence was among the least well-kept secrets in the Lick. Vault's social life, available to anyone with the social fluency to read the specific pattern of outcomes and the specific political dynamics that produced them. They were people who knew and did not act, and whose knowing and not acting was the specific form of complicity that made the rigged lottery's continued operation possible. The treatment of the person who had been selected by the rigged lottery in the period between selection and sacrifice was the aspect of the vault's social life that most directly expressed the moral condition that the decades of corrupted lottery operation had produced in the community, because it was the moment at which the community's collective relationship with the specific injustice it had been perpetuating became most immediately and most unavoidably personal. The selected person was not an abstraction, was someone that every member of the vault's small community knew, had interacted with across years of shared, sealed existence, had shared meals and shared spaces, and shared the specific experience of living in the vault with. The community's response to that person's selection was therefore a response that could not be mediated by the social distance that makes it easier to tolerate abstract injustices. That required each community member to engage with the specific reality of what was being done to someone they knew in ways that made the moral accounting unavoidable, even for people who had developed the most complete forms of psychological accommodation to the lottery's existence. What the vault's records document about this engagement is not what a community organized around genuine justice would produce. The community's response to the selected person was the response of a community that had learned, across the decades of the lottery's operation, to manage the specific psychological and social challenges that proximity to institutionalized sacrifice created through the specific combination of emotional withdrawal and ritual participation that normalized accommodation requires. The selected person was not celebrated or honored in the specific way that genuine voluntary sacrifice might be honored. They had not volunteered, and the community's knowledge that their selection was the product of factional manipulation rather than random chance complicated even the attenuated forms of honorific recognition that the lottery's ritual framework might otherwise have provided. They were not entirely abandoned. The vault's small community and its long shared history made complete social abandonment practically impossible, and the records suggest that specific individuals maintained genuine personal relationships with selected community members through the period between selection and sacrifice in ways that reflected the specific kind of human solidarity that persists even in conditions that make its expression socially costly. But the general pattern of the community's social behavior towards selected lottery victims in the period before their sacrifice was a pattern of progressive social withdrawal, of the specific cooling of collective engagement that the community's psychological self-protection required, and that the factional actors' political interest in normalizing the selection rather than organizing resistance to it reinforced through the specific social influence mechanisms they deployed to manage the community's response to each year's selection. The children of the vault in the period of maximum corruption were children whose entire moral development had occurred in a community whose specific institutional arrangements had made certain moral positions practically unavailable as lived orientations rather than simply theoretical commitments. They understood justice and injustice. The capacity for moral understanding was not absent from vault-born children, and the records preserve evidence of vault-born residents whose moral assessments of the lottery's operation were as clear-eyed as anything the founding generation produced. But they understood justice and injustice within a framework whose specific features had been shaped by the Vault's institutional history in ways that modified the practical implications of moral clarity in the specific direction, accommodation rather than resistance. To know that the lottery was unjust was not, in the Vault's corrupted period, a sufficient condition for effective resistance to the lottery. It required the additional, specific combination of political organization, collective courage, and institutional opportunity that the Vault's political landscape had made progressively more difficult to assemble as the years of factional dominance accumulated. The Vault-born children grew up learning this specific lesson about the relationship between moral clarity and institutional change, and the specific ways in which they learned it through the observation of the adults around them who knew and did not act, through the specific social dynamics that expressed the community's accommodation to its own injustice, were the ways that the Vault's next generation of potential resistors and potential manipulators was formed. The community's collective relationship with the possibility of resistance was the most important single feature of its moral condition in the period of maximum corruption, because it was the relationship that determined whether the specific moral clarity that individuals maintained about the lottery's injustice could be converted into the organized collective action that changing the institutional reality would have required. The available evidence suggests that the Vault community in this period was not a community without awareness of the collective resistance option. The theoretical possibility of simply refusing the annual sacrifice, of organizing the community's full membership around a collective rejection of the requirement that the overseer computer's threat had made the nominal alternative to compliance, was not invisible to the community's members. What the evidence suggests is that the specific combination of practical obstacles to organizing effective collective action in the Vault's factional landscape, the fragmentation of the community's solidarity by factional competition, the specific ways in which each faction's interest in maintaining its lottery manipulation capabilities gave it a stake in the lottery's continued operation, the specific psychological barriers to collective action that the decades of individual accommodation had built in the community's members made the gap between knowing resistance was theoretically possible and organizing resistance practically achievable, a gap that the Vault's political conditions did not provide the specific resources to bridge until the specific developments of the rebellion period finally produced the combination of motivation and opportunity and ideological clarity that collective action required. The conditions that made collective resistance possible in Vault 11 were conditions that the Vault's decades of factional operation had been systematically destroying across the entire period of its most complete political corruption, and understanding why the rebellion emerged when it did, rather than earlier, requires understanding what specific combination of developments finally produced the critical mass of motivation and opportunity and ideological clarity that effective collective action against the lottery required. The rebellion did not emerge because the Vault's community had suddenly become more morally capable than it had been in the years preceding it. The people who organized and joined the resistance were not morally exceptional in the general sense of possessing capacities for moral understanding and moral courage that their predecessors had lacked. They were people whose specific circumstances had produced the specific combination of personal motivation and political opportunity that the earlier community had not been able to assemble simultaneously, and whose specific moment in the Vault's history had provided the particular convergence of factors that made organized resistance viable where it had previously been practically impossible. The accumulation of personal losses was the most important single factor in producing the motivation that the rebellion required, because personal loss was the specific mechanism through which the lottery's abstract institutional injustice was converted into the acute personal grievance that organized political action requires as its emotional fuel. The community members who joined the rebellion were overwhelmingly people whose specific histories within the vault included the loss of someone they cared about, to a lottery selection that they understood to have been the product of factional manipulation rather than random chance. People whose relationship with the lottery's injustice was not simply an intellectual assessment of an institutional arrangement's moral character, but a lived experience of specific loss, whose specific character, the knowledge that the person they had lost had been taken, not by the random chance that the lottery's nominal procedure claimed, but by the specific political calculations of factional actors who had decided that this person's death was acceptable in service of their own members' protection, had transformed their moral orientation from passive accommodation to active opposition. These were people who had crossed the specific psychological threshold at which the cost of continued accommodation exceeded the cost of organized resistance, whose personal accounting of what they stood to lose by not acting had finally exceeded their accounting of what they stood to lose by acting, and whose specific circumstances had produced this crossing at roughly the same moment in the Vault's political history. The political opportunity that made the rebellion viable was the specific configuration of the Vault's factional landscape at the moment of the rebellion's organization, a configuration that had been produced by the specific dynamics of factional competition across the preceding years, and that provided the specific window within which collective action against the lottery could be organized before the factional balance of power reasserted itself in ways that would close the window. The factional landscape's specific configuration at this moment reflected the accumulated consequences of years of factional competition whose specific outcomes had left each of the major factions in a position of relative weakness. Relative to its rivals, a configuration in which no single faction was dominant enough to suppress the rebellion's organization before it reached the critical mass that made suppression impossible, and in which the specific mutual suspicion between the major factions made it impossible for them to organize the collective response to the rebellion that any individual faction's suppression capacity could not accomplish alone. The rebellion's organizers understood this configuration with the specific political fluency of people whose personal losses had driven them to engage with the Vault's political reality at the level of granular analysis rather than general observation, and their timing of the rebellion's organization reflected this understanding, an attempt to act within the specific window that the factional configuration provided before the window closed through the natural dynamics of factional repositioning. The ideological clarity that the rebellion required was the specific form of moral understanding that could bridge the gap between individual grievance and collective action, the shared articulation of what the lottery's operation was doing, and why collective resistance to it was not simply a reasonable response to an unjust situation, but a moral obligation that the community's members owed to each other and to the specific people whose losses had created the motivation for resistance. This ideological clarity was not the product of a single intellectual act or a single political document, but the accumulated product of the specific conversations and the specific shared experiences and the specific acts of mutual recognition between people whose individual moral assessments of the lottery had been developing in parallel across the years of their Vault lives, and who found in each other's specific understanding of the lottery's injustice the confirmation and the amplification that converted individual moral clarity into shared political vision. The rebellion's ideological foundation was not sophisticated in the philosophical sense of having worked through the full complexity of the Vault's moral situation. It had the specific simplicity of a moral position that had been forged through personal loss rather than through theoretical reflection, a simplicity that was both its rhetorical strength and its analytical limitation, but that was entirely adequate for the specific political purpose it needed to serve. The formation of the resistance brought together people whose specific individual histories within the Vault had led them to the same general moral and political conclusion through different specific paths, and the specific combination of motivations and capabilities that the founding members contributed to the organization's development reflected the diversity of those paths. The people whose personal losses were most recent brought the specific intensity of acute grief and the specific moral clarity that grief stripping away of social accommodation can produce. The people whose losses were less recent brought the specific political experience of having navigated the Vault's factional landscape across a longer period of post-loss engagement, having developed through that navigation the specific understanding of the Vault's political mechanics that the rebellion's organization required. The people who had not themselves experienced direct personal loss, but who had witnessed enough of the lottery's specific injustices across their Vault lives to have arrived at the same moral conclusion through observation rather than experience, brought the specific social breadth and the specific political credibility that a movement whose membership was perceived as simply the Vault's latest collection of lottery grief could not have generated. The rebellion's specific demands were the product of the specific political calculation that its organizers had made about what was achievable versus what was theoretically desirable, a calculation whose specific terms reflected both the organizers' understanding of the Vault's political landscape and their assessment of what the community they were trying to organize would support. The demand for a complete end to the lottery, for the collective refusal of the annual sacrifice requirement, accepting the overseer computer's stated consequence of collective death, rather than continuing to comply with the requirement, was the most morally consistent position available to a movement organized around the principle that the lottery's existence was unjust. And the Vault's records suggest that at least some of the rebellion's organizing members held this position as their personal commitment, even if they understood that organizing the broader community around it was a different challenge from holding it themselves. The demand that the broader resistance movement could sustain was something more complicated, a position that combined the refusal of the current lottery cycle's operation with an implicit or explicit acknowledgement that the question of the lottery's complete abolition was a matter whose resolution would require confrontation with the overseer computer's stated consequences in ways that the movement had not yet determined how to address. The factional response to the rebellion's emergence was the response of institutions whose specific power had been built on the lottery's continued operation and whose specific interest in maintaining that power gave them both the motivation and the capability to oppose the resistance movement with the full range of tools that years of factional political operation had developed. The factions did not respond to the rebellion as an undifferentiated monolith. The specific character of each faction's response reflected the specific ways in which the rebellion's success or failure would affect each faction's particular interests and the particular capabilities each had available for its response. The factions whose lottery manipulation capabilities were most completely developed and whose factional protection of their members most thoroughly depended on the lottery's continued operation were the factions whose opposition to the rebellion was most immediate and most organized, because for these factions, the rebellion's success represented not simply a change in institutional arrangements, but the specific dismantling of the power infrastructure that their factional existence had been built to construct and maintain. The factions whose engagement with the lottery's corruption was less complete, whose members' protection had depended less exclusively on the lottery's manipulation and more on the broader social and political resources that factional membership provided, were capable of a more ambiguous response, one that balanced the specific costs that open opposition to a resistance movement of the rebellion's scale would impose against the specific costs that the lottery's abolition would represent for their members. Protection. The broader community's response to the rebellion's emergence was the response of a population that had been living with the specific combination of moral knowledge and practical accommodation that the Vault's decades of corrupted operation had produced, and whose encounter with an organized movement demanding collective action against the lottery required them to make a specific kind of decision that the Vault's political culture had been systematically deferring across those decades. The community members who joined the rebellion were not simply expressing a pre-existing commitment that the rebellion's organization had provided them the opportunity to act on. They were making a specific choice to act on, a moral assessment that they had been choosing not to act on across the preceding years of their Vault lives. A choice whose specific character reflected not simply the rebellion's emergence as an organizational vehicle for collective action, but the specific combination of personal and political circumstances that had made the choice to act feel more achievable and more necessary at this particular moment than it had at any previous moment in the Vault's history. The community members who did not join the rebellion were making the same kind of specific choice, a choice to continue the accommodation that their Vault lives had established as their default orientation, whose specific terms in the rebellion's context involved a decision about whether the rebellion's offered path of organized resistance or the established path of continued compliance represented the less costly option given their specific, personal, and political circumstances. The 5 volunteers who agreed to go to the sacrificial chamber as the rebellion's final engagement with the Vault's lottery system were the most important single group of individuals in the Vault's entire documented history, and understanding who they were and what they understood themselves to be doing requires attention to the specific character of the rebellion's final phase and the specific institutional crisis that the rebellion had produced. They were not, as far as the available records establish, people who had been selected or compelled for this role by the rebellion's broader organization. They were people who had understood the specific situation that the rebellion had created and who had made the specific personal. The decision that volunteering to go to the chamber was what the situation required. The available evidence does not allow a complete reconstruction of the specific deliberations through which this group assembled itself, but the general character of those deliberations can be inferred from the specific context in which the decision was made. A rebellion that had organized collective resistance to the annual sacrifice requirement was now facing the Gaiman Overseer Computer's stated alternative to compliance, and the specific question of what to do with that alternative was the question that the 5 volunteers had decided to answer through personal action rather than through the collective deliberation that the broader communities divided. Response to the rebellion had made practically impossible. What the 5 volunteers understood about what they were walking into is the question whose answer is most essential for understanding the moral character of their decision, and the honest answer is that the available evidence does not establish with certainty that they understood what they were walking into, in the specific sense of knowing what the sacrificial chamber's encounter would actually reveal. They knew what the chamber had been used for across the Vault's entire history. They knew, as every Vault resident knew, that the sacrificial chamber was where the annual lottery victim was delivered, and where the automated systems that the Overseer Computer controlled ended that victim's life. They knew that going to the chamber as the rebellion's representatives was placing themselves in the specific physical location where the Vault's annual sacrifice occurred, and they could not have been unaware that this placement carried the specific risk that it would be interpreted by the Overseer Computer as the compliance with the annual requirement that the rebellion had been organized to refuse. What they understood about what the chamber might reveal beyond this, whether any of them anticipated the specific content of the Overseer Computer's announcement, whether the specific possibility that the chamber's encounter might produce something other than their deaths had been a factor in their deliberations, is a question that the available records do not definitively resolve. The approach to the chamber was the approach of people who had committed to a course of action whose specific consequences they understood to be potentially their deaths, and the specific quality of courage that this commitment required was the specific quality of courage that the Vault's entire history had been building toward as its moral test, the capacity to accept personal sacrifice, not as the result of being selected by a rigged lottery whose random chance fiction concealed factional calculation, but as the product of a voluntary choice to confront the institutional reality that the community's decades of accommodation had sustained. The 5 volunteers were doing what the lottery's founding principle had always nominally described, but had never actually produced a genuine voluntary engagement with the sacrifice requirement, approached not through the compulsion of selection, but through the specific moral decision that the situation required someone to make, and that they had decided they would be the ones to make. The specific irony of this, that the rebellion against the lottery had produced the Vault's first genuinely voluntary sacrifice candidates in its entire history, was an irony that the 5 volunteers may or may not have consciously recognized, but that the full moral accounting of the Vault's history makes impossible to overlook. The sacrificial chamber was a space whose physical character had been shaped by its function, in the same way that every space used regularly for a specific purpose over a long period of time acquires the specific character of that purpose. In its physical fabric, in the specific marks of use, and the specific atmosphere of accumulated significance that the repeated performance of a specific act in a specific space deposits in the space's character over time. The 5 volunteers who entered the chamber were entering a space that every Vault resident knew by reputation and that most had never entered. A space whose specific physical features, the terminal, the access corridor, the automated systems whose mechanisms had ended the lives of every previous occupant, were both familiar from description and strange from the specific quality that significant spaces always have when encountered directly after long familiarity through the accounts of others. The chamber was not large. The Vault's architecture had not given the annual sacrifice more physical space than its specific procedural requirements demanded, and the smallness of the space, its specific intimacy relative to the scale of what it had been used for across the Vault's decades of operation, was itself a feature of the encounter whose specific character the 5 volunteers would have registered with the specific attentiveness that people bring to spaces they understand to be potentially the last space they will ever occupy. The overseer computer's announcement in the chamber was the announcement that recontextualized everything that had preceded it in the Vault's history, and its specific content was the specific content that the Vault's entire experimental design had been organized to make possible, not the termination of the 5 volunteers' lives in the manner that every previous occupant of the chamber had experienced, but the revelation that the sacrifice requirement had never been what the overseer computer's original announcement had described. The experiment's true nature, as the computer's announcement in the chamber established, was not the experiment of a community's compliance with an unjust authority's annual death requirement. Or rather, it was that, but it was also something more. Something whose specific character the community's behavior across the Vault's decades had been documenting without the community's knowledge that documentation was occurring. The Vault had not been testing whether its residents would comply with the sacrifice requirement. It had been testing whether they would refuse it, whether a community, given the specific institutional conditions that the Vault's design had created, would eventually produce the collective moral courage to reject the annual sacrifice requirement in the face of the stated consequence of collective death, whether the specific combination of personal loss and accumulated injustice and moral clarity that the Vault's operation had been systematically producing would eventually overcome the specific combination of factional interest, individual accommodation that had sustained compliance across the decades of the lottery's corrupted operation. The specific content of the overseer computer's revelation in the chamber addressed the 5 volunteers in the specific terms of the announcement that every Vault resident had been waiting for across the entire period of the Vault's sealed existence, not the terms of threat and requirement that the original announcement had established, but the terms of evaluation and conclusion that the experimental design had always been building toward. the community had passed the test, or rather, the community had eventually passed a test that it had been failing for the entire period of the lottery's operation, had eventually produced the specific collective moral response that the test had been designed to measure through the specific path of accumulated loss and factional corruption and individual transformation and organized rebellion that the Vault's history documents, arriving at the specific moral threshold that the experiment required, not through the straightforward collective rejection of the lottery that the experiment's most optimistic design might have anticipated, but through the specific, long and compromised path that the Vault's actual human community had taken to arrive at the same destination. What the announcement established about the experiment's true design was not simply that the sacrifice requirement was not what it had appeared to be, that the Vault's residents had been dying unnecessarily across the creative decades of the lottery's operation, that the specific factional manipulations and the specific personal losses and the specific accumulation of institutional injustice that the Vault's history documents had been occurring in service of a research question, rather than as the necessary cost of survival. It established that the Vault's entire history had been the experiment, that every death and every factional compromise and every Catherine Stone and every individual who had been delivered to the sacrificial chamber by the specific political calculations of the factional actors had been data, had been the specific behavioral evidence that Vault-Tech's researchers had designed the Vault to produce, had been the human cost of answering a question about moral psychology that the researchers had decided was worth answering through these specific methods. The revelation was the revelation of what the Vault's entire history meant in the terms of the institutional framework that had created it, and the specific character of that, meaning the transformation of the community's entire history of suffering from the necessary cost of survival into the deliberate product of an institutional design, was the most devastating single piece of information that any Vault's residents had ever received about the nature of the world they had been living in. The 5 volunteers' response to the Overseer computer's revelation was a response that the available records document only partially, whose specific emotional and deliberative character in the moment of the announcement can be reconstructed only imperfectly from the evidence that the chamber's aftermath preserved. What the records do establish is that the response produced a specific outcome, that the chamber encounter did not simply end with the 5 volunteers emerging to report the revelation to the broader community, but produced a specific consequence whose character reflected the specific combination of the volunteers' response to the revelation and the chamber's automated systems response to whatever choice the volunteers made in the aftermath of receiving it. The Vault's subsequent condition, the specific state in which the courier eventually discovers it, is the most direct available evidence for what the chamber encounter ultimately produced, and the specific character of that evidence is evidence whose full implications require careful examination rather than simple description. The moral calculus of the Overseer computer's revelation operates on multiple levels simultaneously, and engaging with it seriously requires resisting the temptation to resolve its complexity through the specific kind of interpretive move that makes one level the correct level and dismisses the others as less important. At the most immediate level, the revelation is the revelation of a specific deception, the specific fact that the Vault's residents had been told that compliance with the sacrifice requirement was necessary for their collective survival, when the truth was that the requirement was an experimental parameter whose consequences for non-compliance were not what the original announcement had described. This deception had produced specific deaths, specific losses, specific factional corruptions, and specific personal transformations, and specific rebellions, all of which would not have occurred in the specific forms they took if the community had known from the beginning what the chamber's final announcement revealed. The moral weight of this deception is not diminished by the framing of the experimental design whose purposes it served. The fact that the deception was institutionally motivated does not make its specific consequences less real or less unjust for the people who experienced them. At a deeper level, The revelation is the revelation of a specific moral framework, the framework within which Vault-Tech's experimental designers had evaluated the Vault community's behavior across the full period of its documented history, the specific understanding of what human moral behavior should look like under extreme institutional pressure that the experiment had been designed to measure. The overseer computer's evaluation of the community's behavior in the chamber announcement was an evaluation in terms of this framework, and the specific terms of the evaluation, the conclusion that the community had passed the test, that its eventual production of organized collective resistance to the sacrifice requirement constituted the morally correct response that the experiment had been designed to elicit, were the terms of a moral framework whose specific assumptions about human moral psychology and human moral obligation is the Vault's history had both confirmed and complicated in ways that the framework's designers may not have fully anticipated. The question of whether the experiment's moral framework was itself morally defensible is the question that the revelation forces most directly, because the specific claim that the community had passed the test requires accepting the specific moral logic through which the experimental designers had determined what passing the test meant. The logic that the appropriate response to the sacrifice requirement was its collective refusal, that the community's decades of compliance represented a moral failure rather than a rational response to a credible threat, that the specific personal losses and factional corruptions and institutional injustices that the decades of compliance had produced were the acceptable costs of a research program designed to measure whether human communities possessed the collective moral courage that compliance had demonstrated they lacked. This logic has a specific coherence within the moral framework of the experimental design, and the community's eventual production of organized resistance does represent something genuinely significant about human moral psychology, a demonstration that the specific combination of personal loss and collective organization and ideological clarity can eventually overcome the specific combination of individual accommodation and institutional pressure that the experimental design had arranged to test it against. But the specific costs at which this demonstration was purchased, the specific human lives, and the specific human suffering that the decades of the experiment's operation had produced, are costs whose acceptance as the price of a research question requires a moral calculation whose specific terms most people would find difficult to endorse. The Vault's history reveals about human nature something that is simultaneously more hopeful and more disturbing than either a simple story of human wickedness or a simple story of human resilience would provide. It is more hopeful than a simple story of wickedness, because the rebellion's eventual emergence, the specific production of organized collective resistance to institutionalized injustice through the specific path of accumulated loss and political organization and moral clarity that the Vault's history documents, demonstrates that the specific human capacities for moral courage and collective action are not eliminated by the institutional conditions that make their exercise most costly, that they persist through decades of suppression and accommodation and emerge when the specific combination of conditions that activates them is eventually produced. The people who organized the rebellion and the 5 volunteers who went to the chamber were not morally exceptional in ways that separate them from the rest of the Vault's community. They were people whose specific circumstances had activated the specific moral capacities that their community had been failing to activate across the preceding decades. And the activation of those capacities in the specific circumstances that produced it demonstrates something important about the persistence of moral possibility, even in conditions that seem most effectively designed to eliminate it. It is more disturbing than a simple story of resilience, because the specific path through which the moral capacities were eventually activated was a path whose costs were enormous and whose specific character demonstrates something troubling about the conditions under which institutional injustice is actually resisted rather than simply theoretically resistible. The Vault's community did not resist the lottery in its founding period, when the specific moral clarity about the requirements in justice was most broadly shared and the specific costs of compliance were most acutely felt. It did not resist during the middle decades, when the lottery's corruption was most extensively documented in the records that the community's own members were creating. It resisted after decades of compliance and corruption, and specific accumulated losses had produced the specific combination of motivation and opportunity and ideological clarity that effective collective action required after the specific institutional conditions for resistance had been assembled not through deliberate moral effort, but through the specific dynamics of factional competition and personal loss that the vault's experimental design had set in motion. The resistance eventually happened, but the path to it was a path whose length and whose specific character raised serious questions about the conditions under which human communities can be expected to resist institutionalized injustice without the specific extreme accumulation of costs that the vault's history documents as the necessary precondition for organized collective action. The spectrum of moral response within the vault, across its full documented history, is the most complete available evidence for the specific distribution of moral behavior that the vault's experimental conditions produced in an ordinary human community, and its examination reveals a distribution that is neither the uniformly dark picture that the lottery's corruption might suggest, nor the uniformly hopeful picture that the rebellion's eventual emergence might imply, but something more complex and more illuminating than either simplified version provides. The founding generation that improvised the lottery as a mechanism for managing the sacrifice requirement was making a moral choice whose specific terms, the preference for distributing the lottery's burden through random selection rather than through the alternatives that would have concentrated it in specific, identifiable individuals, reflected a genuine moral commitment to fairness, that the subsequent history's corruption should not be allowed to retroactively eliminate from the accounting. The factional actors whose manipulation of the lottery's operation represents the vault's most extensively documented form of moral failure were people whose specific choices were the product of the specific institutional conditions that the vault's design had created, and whose moral failure was real, without being the simple wickedness that a less contextual analysis might assign it. Catherine Stone was both a victim and a perpetrator, and the specific character of her trajectory through the vault's moral landscape illuminates something important about how the experience of institutional injustice both motivates resistance and reproduces the specific forms of behavior that sustain the injustice. The 5 volunteers represent the vault's most complete moral achievement, the specific form of voluntary personal sacrifice in service of collective welfare that the experimental design had been organized to measure, and their achievement was real without being unambiguous in the specific ways that genuine heroism in genuinely complex circumstances always resists simple celebration. The normalization problem that Vault 11's history most completely documents is the problem of how communities arrive at the specific condition in which institutionalized injustice has been so thoroughly incorporated into the fabric of social life that the mechanisms for resisting it are no longer practically available to the people who are theoretically capable of deploying them. How the specific combination of psychological adaptation and social pressure and institutional design produces a condition in which moral clarity about an institution's injustice coexists with practical inability to organize effective resistance to it, and in which the specific gap between moral assessment and political action is maintained not through the absence of moral understanding, but through the specific ways in which the institutional environment has restructured the practical conditions under which moral understanding can be converted into political change. The Vault documents this problem with a completeness and a specificity that no other single case study in the franchise's history matches, and what it reveals about the problem's specific mechanisms and its specific conditions for resolution is something that extends far beyond the Vault's particular institutional situation to illuminate something important about the general human experience of living within unjust institutions and the specific conditions under which unjust institutions change. The experiment's deepest question, the question that the overseer computer's final announcement suggests, was the question the experimental design was ultimately organized to answer, was not simply the question of whether a community would comply with an unjust authority's death requirement, but the question of what it takes for human communities to stop complying with unjust institutional arrangements when compliance is sustained by a specific combination of credible threat and social normalization that the Vault's design had most completely realized. This is a question whose answer the Vault's history provides, not in the clean form of a controlled experiment's definitive finding, but in the specific form of a documented human history whose complexity resists reduction to the find, kind of clean generalization that would make the finding easily portable to other contexts. What it took for Vault 11's community to stop complying was the specific accumulation of personal losses and the specific development of factional politics and the specific emergence of organized resistance and the specific production of 5 volunteers willing to go to the chamber a specific path whose particular character reflected the particular institutional conditions of the Vault and the particular human community that inhabited it, and whose generalization to other institutional contexts requires the kind of careful attention to context that the Vault's own history demands of anyone attempting to read it as something other than a specific story about specific people in specific circumstances. The Vault program's broader context within the Fallout universe does not diminish the specific significance of Vault 11's particular experiment. The existence of other Vaults whose experimental designs tested other aspects of human behavior does not make any single Vault's history less important for what it specifically reveals, but it does provide a comparative framework within which the Vault 11 experiment's specific character and specific ambitions can be more clearly understood. The Vault experiments ranged across an enormous spectrum of specific research questions and specific institutional designs, from the relatively benign social variations that some Vaults tested to the specific forms of extreme psychological and biological experimentation that the darkest of the Vault designs produced. Vault 11 occupies a specific position within this spectrum, not the most extreme in its physical violence toward its residents, not the most obviously malicious in the specific character of its experimental design, but the most philosophically ambitious in its specific attempt to measure something important and difficult about human moral psychology, rather than simply to produce data about human behavioral responses to specific forms of institutional pressure. The experiment's ambition was the ambition of people who believed they were asking the most important question that the Vault program could be used to answer whether human communities are capable of the specific form of program, collective moral courage that the voluntary refusal of institutionalized death requires, and whether or not that belief justified the specific methods through which the question was pursued. The belief itself reveals something important about the moral framework within which the Vault program's designers understood their own work. Vault-Tech's moral status as the designer and implementer of Vault 11's experiment is not diminished by the experimental framing that the revelation provides for the Vault's history, and the specific argument that the experiment's ultimate purpose was the measurement of human moral courage, rather than the simple infliction of suffering, does not convert the specific suffering the experiment produced from a moral cost into an acceptable research expense. The distinction between an experiment designed to test human moral courage and an experiment designed to inflict suffering is a distinction that makes a difference to the moral assessment of the experimental designer's intentions, but not to the moral assessment of the experimental design's actual consequences. The specific deaths and the specific losses and the specific corruptions, that the Vault's history documents were real consequences, whose specific character was determined by the experimental design, regardless of what the designer's specific intentions were in creating that design. Vault-Tec built a machine that killed people and corrupted communities and produced specific forms of institutional injustice across decades of operation. And the fact that the machine was designed to eventually reveal that the killing and the corruption and the injustice had been unnecessary does not make the killing and the corruption and the injustice less real or less morally significant. In the accounting of what the machine accomplished during its operational period, the vault that the courier finds is a vault that has been sealed in a different sense from the sealing that the bomb's fall originally produced. Sealed not by the emergency closure of a survival shelter responding to existential threat, but by the specific finality of a community that has reached the end of its institutional existence and left the physical space of that existence behind in the specific condition of a place that has been inhabited for decades and then vacated without the possibility of return. The difference between these two kinds of sealing is the difference between a door that has been closed against the world outside and a door that has been closed against nothing. Because the world outside is no longer the relevant boundary, the vault's sealed condition at the time of the courier's discovery reflects not the community's protection from the wasteland, but the wasteland's indifference to the vault. The specific quality of abandonment that belongs to places whose purpose has been exhausted and whose physical presence in the landscape is now simply the persistence of structures that no one has found sufficient reason to demolish. Moving through Vault 11 as the courier encounters, it is moving through a space that communicates its history through its physical character before any of the documentary record has been consulted. Through the specific combination of preservation and decay that the decades of vacancy have deposited on the vault's surfaces and in its atmosphere, and in the particular quality of stillness that distinguishes spaces where human activity has permanently ceased from spaces where human activity is simply temporarily absent. The vault's infrastructure, the life support systems, the lighting, the mechanical apparatus that maintained the physical conditions of sealed existence across the community's decades of habitation continues to function in the partial and degraded way that automated systems function when they have been operating without maintenance for the period of time that separates the vault's vacancy from the courier's arrival, providing enough illumination and enough atmospheric circulation to make the space navigable without providing the specific quality of functional habitability that a living community would require. The lights that work and the lights that do not work, the sections where the air circulation is adequate and the sections where it is not, the specific pattern of functional and non-functional infrastructure across the vault's layout. These are evidence of how long the vault has been vacant and of the specific sequence in which its automated systems have degraded in the absence of the human maintenance that their continued operation requires. And reading this evidence is part of the experience of moving through the space as someone attempting to understand what happened here. The living spaces that the vault's residential areas contain are the most intimate archaeological layer of the vault's physical record. The spaces where the specific character of the community's daily existence is most directly preserved in the arrangement and condition of the objects that the community's members left behind when they departed. The specific inventory of what remains in these spaces, the personal possessions that were not taken, the evidence of the specific daily routines and the specific personal relationships and the specific forms of individual and collective life that the community's members maintained across the decades of their sealed existence, is the inventory of a community's material culture at the moment of its end, and the specific character of what was left and what was taken is itself evidence about the specific circumstances of the departure. Communities that leave in an organized and anticipated way take different things with them than communities that leave in crisis or in the sudden aftermath of an institutional catastrophe. And the specific pattern of what Vault 11's residents left in their living spaces is evidence about the specific character of the Vault's end that the documentary record confirms, but that the physical evidence establishes independently. The common spaces, the dining hall, the recreation areas, the community gathering spaces whose specific design reflected the founding community's attempt to maintain something of normal social life within the Vault's constraints, are spaces whose current condition is evidence of a community that was using them until relatively close to the Vault's end, that had not allowed them to fall into disuse in the way that communities, in the process of social dissolution, sometimes abandon the specific spaces whose function requires the collective participation that dissolution makes unavailable. The tables and the chairs and the specific arrangements of the furniture in these spaces are the arrangements of a community that was eating and gathering and spending time in shared spaces until the specific events that produced the Vault's vacancy concluded the community's shared existence in those spaces. And the specific degree of order or disorder in those arrangements is evidence about how much warning the community had of its end and how much collective capacity it retained at the moment of its conclusion. The administrative areas contain the documentary record that is the most directly informative layer of the Vault's physical evidence, the terminal entries and the holotapes and the paper records whose specific content establishes the factional politics and the lottery manipulations and the personal histories and the institutional developments that the Vault's decades of operation produced. The experience of accessing this documentary record in the Vault's specific physical context, in the actual administrative spaces where the records were created, surrounded by the specific evidence of the institutional life, whose documentation the records preserve, is an experience whose specific quality differs from the experience of accessing the same information in a different context, in the way that reading a letter in the room where it was written differs from reading the same letter in a library. The physical context does not change the documentary content, but it modifies the specific experience of receiving that content in ways that the courier's encounter with the Vault's administrative record must have reflected the specific weight of reading documentation of institutional injustice in the specific space where the institution was administered, surrounded by the physical evidence of the community whose specific history the documentation preserves. The terminal entries that the courier discovers in the administrative areas are the most complete single source of information about the Vault's political history available in the Fallout universe's documented landscape and their specific content. The records of factional negotiations and lottery manipulations and personal grievances and institutional decisions and individual moral reckonings is the content of a community's political life captured in the specific documentary form that the Vault's terminal infrastructure made available to its members for the recording of the specific things they wanted to preserve. The terminals were not a public record system in the sense of a documentary infrastructure designed to create an official account of the Vault's institutional history. They were a collection of personal and factional records, whose specific authors had specific purposes in mind when they created them, purposes that were not primarily the creation of a historical record for future researchers, but the specific practical purposes of factional documentation and personal expression that the Vault's political life had made the primary uses of the terminal infrastructure. The historical record that these documents collectively constitute is therefore not the record that anyone designed it to be, but the record that emerges from the aggregate of specific documents created for specific immediate purposes. And reading it as history requires the specific interpretive work of understanding each document's specific context and specific purpose before assessing its contribution to the larger picture. The Catherine Stone entries are among the most extensively documented individual histories in the Vault's terminal record, and encountering them in the specific context of the Vault's physical space in the administrative terminals where her specific engagements with the vault's political machinery are documented. Surrounded by the evidence of the institutional life she navigated is an encounter with a specific human story, whose specific emotional weight the physical context amplifies rather than diminishes. The entries that document her husband's selection and her response to it are the entries whose reading most directly engages the specific moral complexity that the vault's history embodies. The entries of a person whose trajectory from victim to manipulator was the product of the specific institutional conditions that the vault had created, and whose specific decisions within those conditions are simultaneously comprehensible as responses to those conditions and troubling as expressions of what those conditions had made of the person who had entered them as a victim. Reading these entries in the space where they were created is reading a specific human life's most significant documents in the specific physical context of the institutional machinery that shaped that life. And the experience of the reading is an experience that cannot be fully separated from the experience of the space. The Justice Block records are the documentary layer that most completely establishes the factional politics whose specific operations the vault's lottery corruption required, and their specific content. The records of the faction's internal deliberations and external negotiations and specific lottery-related activities is the content of an organized political body's institutional life, captured in the documentary form that its members used for factual recording and political calculation rather than for personal expression. The factual quality of these records, their relative freedom from the specific emotional register of the personal entries that the most individual voices in the vault's documentary record produce, makes them the most reliable single source for the specific operational details of the factional manipulation, the specific evidence from which the mechanics of the rigging can be reconstructed with the most confidence. But their factual quality also makes them the layer of the documentary record that is most difficult to engage with emotionally in the way that the personal entries make unavoidable. They are the bureaucratic record of an institution whose activities produced specific human suffering, and the specific combination of institutional competence and moral corruption that they document is the combination that institutional records of injustice are most commonly preserve, the evidence of people doing their institutional jobs effectively in service of purposes whose moral character is not reflected in the specific documentary form through which those purposes are pursued. The holotapes that the vault's residents created are the documentary layer whose specific content most directly communicates the individual human voices of the community, the personal recordings whose makers had decided that the specific content of their communication required the spoken form that holotape technology made available rather than the written form that the terminal infrastructure provided. The voices on these tapes are voices speaking from within the specific institutional conditions that the vault's experimental design had created. Voices whose specific tonal character reflects the particular emotional and psychological situation of people, navigating the specific combination of sealed confinement and annual lottery and factional politics that the vault's life involved. Hearing these voices in the vault's current condition in the specific physical spaces where they were recorded, among the specific physical evidence of the lives they represent, is hearing the specific human reality of the vault's history in the form that is closest to the direct experience of the people who lived it. And the specific quality of that hearing is the quality of an encounter with individual human beings, rather than simply with historical documentation. The sacrificial chamber is the space that every other space in the vault has been organized around since the moment the overseer computer made its initial announcement. The space to which the vault's entire institutional life has been oriented in the specific way that a community's life is oriented toward the specific institutional reality that constitutes its most fundamental organizational principle. Moving through the vault toward the chamber is moving through the accumulated evidence of a community's relationship with this specific space across the decades of that relationship's development through the living spaces. Where the lottery's annual threat was the organizing anxiety of daily existence through the administrative spaces, where the factional politics that the lottery had generated were conducted and documented, through the community spaces where the specific social dynamics that the lottery had produced were played out in the specific forms of collective life that the vault's sealed conditions permitted, and finally to the chamber itself, the space at the center of everything. The approach to the chamber communicates the specific accumulation of the vault's history in a way that arriving at the chamber directly would not. Each space passed through is another layer of the evidence, another specific dimension of what happened here, and the specific weight of that accumulation is present in the experience of the final approach in a way that makes the chamber's encounter different from what it would be without the approach's specific preparation. The chamber's physical character is the physical character of a space that was designed for a specific function and that bears in its design the specific marks of that function's requirements. It is not a large space. The vault's architects had not given the annual sacrifice the physical grandeur that might have suggested the ritual significance that the lottery's operation had developed around it across the farming decades of the community's compliance. It is a functional space, designed with the specific attention to the mechanical and procedural requirements of its operation that the experimental design demanded, and the specific functionality of its design is itself evidence of the specific character of the institutional perspective from which the sacrifice requirement was conceived, the perspective of people who had designed the chamber as a research apparatus rather than as a ritual space, for whom the annual sacrifice's significance was the data it generated, rather than the institutional meaning that the vault's community had inevitably accumulated around it across the years of its operation. The terminal in the chamber is the terminal through which the overseer computer's final communication was delivered, and its current condition is the condition of a system that has completed its operational program and that now persists in the vault's infrastructure in the specific way that automated systems persist when the specific purposes they were designed to serve have been concluded. The terminal is accessible to the courier. Its content is available for the reading that the documentary record requires, and what it contains is the specific record of the chamber's final operation, the overseer computer's final announcement, and whatever documentation of the chamber encounter the system preserved in the aftermath of that announcement. Reading this record in the chamber where the announcement was delivered is the experience whose specific quality most completely concentrates the vault's entire history into a single moment of encounter, the experience of being in the specific space where the experiment's final revelation occurred, reading the specific record of that revelation, surrounded by the specific physical evidence of the institution whose entire purpose that revelation had finally disclosed. The physical evidence of what happened to the 5 volunteers in the aftermath of the overseer computer's announcement is the physical evidence that the chamber's current condition preserves. And what it preserves is the specific evidence that the vault's subsequent condition reflects the evidence of an outcome whose specific character produced the specific state of emptiness and finality that the couriers encounter with the vault documents. The vault's residential areas are empty, not because the community evacuated in an organized departure, but because the specific outcome of the chamber encounter produced consequences that the community that had sent 5 of its members to the chamber could not survive in its existing form. Consequences whose specific character is established by the available evidence and whose full implications for the moral accounting of what the chamber encounter ultimately accomplished require examination rather than simply description. The vault is empty. The community is gone. The specific path from the rebellion's organization to the chamber encounter to the vault's current emptiness is the path whose specific character the available evidence establishes, and what that character reveals about the relationship between institutional revelation and institutional consequence is the final layer of the vault's moral accounting. The legacy of Vault 11 in the Mojave Wastelands broader landscape is a legacy that operates primarily through the specific documentary record that the vault preserves, rather than through any continuing institutional presence that the vault maintains in the wasteland's political life, because the institution that produced the documentary record has ceased to exist in the specific form that institutional presence requires. The terminal entries and the holotapes are available to anyone who makes their way into the vault's sealed environment with the technical capability to access them, and the specific content of those records, the factional politics and the lottery manipulations, and the individual moral histories and the institutional revelations is content whose implications for the wastelands surviving communities are potentially significant if those communities encounter and engage with it. But the wasteland's surviving communities are communities whose relationship with documented history is shaped by the specific conditions of post-war existence. Communities whose members are generally more immediately concerned with the specific practical challenges of survival than with the specific moral lessons of a sealed vault's institutional history, and whose capacity to engage with historical documentation in the ways that would make that documentation's implications practically effective is constrained by the specific forms of educational and institutional infrastructure that the Great War's destruction of the pre-war world's cultural and informational systems has left them without. The question of what Vault 11's history contributes to the Mojave's political and moral landscape is therefore the question of what historically documented institutional injustice contributes to the practical, moral, and political life of communities that encounter it without the institutional infrastructure for systematic engagement with historical documentation, communities that can read the terminal entries and hear the holotapes, but that lack the specific educational and cultural resources that would allow those readings and hearings to be integrated into a shared understanding of what the documentation means and what its implications are for the community's own institutional arrangements and political choices. The contribution is real. The Vault's documentary record is the kind of evidence that individual encounters can transform into genuine moral education, that specific people who make their way through the Vault's evidence can carry back into the wasteland's living communities in the form of specific understanding whose implications for their own community's institutional arrangements may be genuinely significant. But the contribution is also limited by the specific conditions of the wasteland's informational landscape, and the gap between the Vault's preserved record and its potential influence on the wasteland's living political culture is itself evidence of something important about how historical documentation functions in post-institutional environments. The Vault's silence is the most fundamental piece of evidence in the space, more fundamental than any specific terminal entry or any specific physical artifact, because the silence is the evidence that encompasses everything else, the specific quality of the space that reflects the outcome of the entire history that every other piece of evidence documents. The Vault was designed for perpetual habitation. Its life support systems were built to maintain the conditions of human existence across the indefinite duration of the post-war period, to sustain the specific community that the ceiling had created through whatever length of time the surface's recovery from the bomb's effects required. The silence that the courier encounters, instead of the habitation the Vault was designed to sustain, is therefore not simply the silence of absence, but the silence of a specific failure of the design's most fundamental purpose. The silence of a vault that was built to keep people alive, and that is not keeping anyone alive. That has been emptied of the specific human presence whose maintenance was the entire point of its construction. This silence is the final evidence in the Vault's documentary record, The piece of evidence that the overseer computer's specific experimental design produced through the specific path of lottery and corruption and rebellion and chamber revelation and whatever happened next, and its specific character, the specific quality of permanent finality that distinguishes a space that will not be reoccupied from a space that is simply temporarily vacant, is the character of an experiment that has concluded in the most complete way an experiment can conclude, by producing a result that cannot be revised or continued or reopened through any subsequent research protocol. The lottery drum is still. Whatever specific form the lottery mechanism took in the vault's procedural architecture, the physical apparatus through which the annual selections were conducted across the decades of the lottery's operation is now at rest in the specific way that mechanisms at rest permanently differ from mechanisms at rest temporarily, in the specific stillness of something that has performed its function for the last time and that will not perform it again. The drum, if it was a drum, turned annually across the decades of the vault's sealed existence, organizing its annual motion around the specific purpose of selecting the person whose death would fulfill the institutional requirement that the overseer computer had announced at sealing, and that the community had been honoring and manipulating and resisting across the full period of the vault's operation. It turned for the founding community's first terrible application of the lottery's random selection principle. It turned across the middle decades of the lottery's corruption, its nominal randomness providing the procedural cover for the factional calculations that were actually determining its outcomes. It turned into the period of the rebellion, its operation challenged for the first time in organized collective terms rather than individual factional ones. And now it does not turn. And the specific stillness of its not turning is the specific evidence of everything that the vault's history produced, not the triumph of the lottery's abolition achieved through the community's survival into a post-lottery future, but the specific silence of an institution and a community that reached their end together through the specific path that the vault's experimental design had set in motion. What remains in Vault 11 is everything and nothing. Everything in the sense that the physical evidence and the documentary record and the specific preserved atmosphere of a sealed space whose human occupants are gone constitute a more complete surviving record of a community's institutional life than almost any other location in the wasteland provides, and nothing in the sense that the community whose institutional life the evidence preserves is gone in the most complete way that a community can be gone, absent from the space it inhabited, without the possibility of the return that would convert absence into mere vacancy. The vault preserves the record of what happened here with the specific completeness that sealed environments preserve things, maintaining in its specific condition the evidence of every specific dimension of the community's history, from its founding, through its corruption, through its rebellion, through its final encounter with the institutional reality that its experimental design had always been moving toward. This preservation is not the preservation of a living community's institutional continuity, but the preservation of a dead community's institutional record, the specific kind of preservation that archaeological sites provide, rather than the preservation that living institutions maintain through their ongoing operation. And so we arrive at the end of the descent into Vault 11, the end of the journey through the lottery drum and the factional records and the Catherine Stone entries and the 5 volunteers and the sacrificial chamber's final announcement. You have been in the sealed space tonight, Wanderer, have followed the community from its founding, through its compliance and its corruption and its rebellion and its end. You have found in the specific human story, it documents neither the simple warning about institutional evil that a less careful reading might extract from it, nor the simple celebration of moral courage that the rebellion's eventual emergence might seem to justify, but something more difficult and more true than either simplified version provides the specific evidence of what happens to ordinary human communities when ordinary institutional pressures are applied with the specific thoroughness and the specific duration that the vault's experimental design achieved, and the specific conditions under which those communities eventually find their way to the organized moral courage that the conditions had been systematically destroying across the years of their operation. The people of Vault 11 were not exceptional. They were not more wicked than any other community would have been in their specific circumstances, and they were not more heroic than the specific combination of loss and organization and opportunity and clarity that their specific circumstances eventually produced in the specific people who organized the resistance and went to the chamber. They were people doing what ordinary people do under extraordinary institutional pressure, accommodating and complaining and manipulating and grieving, and eventually, when the specific conditions for organized resistance finally converged, resisting. The Vault's history is their history, and it is a history that belongs to no sealed space alone, but to every institutional arrangement that asks ordinary people to accept extraordinary injustice in the name of survival, and to every question about what it takes for those people to eventually say no. Rest now, wanderer. The lottery drum is still. The vault is silent in the way of spaces that have finished their purpose and await only the slow return to the dust that the wasteland makes of everything eventually. The 5 volunteers went to the chamber and found what was waiting there. The community that sent them is gone. The record of what they all were, the manipulators and the victims and the resistors and the compromised and the courageous and the ordinary people, who were all of these things in different proportions across the specific years of their sealed lives, is preserved in the terminals and the holotapes and the specific stillness of the space, waiting for whoever finds their way inside. You found your way inside tonight. You carry the record with you now, out of the vault and into the wasteland and into whatever rest the night provides. The drum is still. Sleep well.